Broad spoiler warning for Ahsoka episodes 1 to 6, you've been warned. Here's a question: what's the relationship between television streaming, release strategy, and pacing? Here's another question: are format issues holding Star Wars back? Like a lot of you, I've been watching Ahsoka. Like a lot of you, I've generally been having a good time with the show, especially for the past few episodes. But I think there are a couple of interesting wrinkles that merit a deep dive, or well, a medium dive. So in this video, we'll talk about where Ahsoka stands at present, as well as what's held it back, and a certain wider dissonance visible in today's television ecosystem. Let's roll. Wait, actually, just before I talk about my feelings on the show, we need to get something out of the way. The elephant in the room here is, of course, the fact that neither I nor I'd wager the majority of Ahsoka's viewers are able to fully appreciate the show. Because it isn't simply the latest chapter in the Disney Plus Star Wars TV universe, although yes, it is that too. It's also a sequel series, and a fairly direct one at that, to both Rebels and the Clone Wars. This fact isn't what this video's about, but I think we do have to talk about it, just briefly. Insofar as there's a problem here, it's not that those cartoons got a live-action spin-off. That's fine, that's great. It's that this spin-off is nailed into the same thorny narrative pipeline as The Mandalorian, a show largely digestible by itself, which successfully and intentionally captured a mass audience. The fact that to really know what's going on here, to be able to emotionally tune into where these characters are, what their decisions mean, you've got to have watched 11 seasons worth of animated shows is wild. Because it's not like that backlog is an easy watch either.
What happened?
You owe Rexter your skin, Sky Guy.
Yeah, the Clone Wars gets good, I know, I've been told. But it doesn't start good, and that's what's important. Unless you are a literal child, you will have a hard time starting and sticking with the narrative backlog here. That is the elephant in the room. It is a baffling elephant to have in the room, and due to its presence, you'll have to take my thoughts on the show with a grain of salt. But watching Ahsoka, you do eventually stop noticing the elephant so much. You acclimatize to its presence. And beyond it lies what is, so far, a pretty cool show. The best Disney Plus era Star Wars projects have always seemed to channel individual elements of the Lucas Star Wars gumbo. The Mandalorian draws on the pulp, Andor the politics, Kenobi the drama, and so it feels only natural that with Ahsoka we finally get to the COD mysticism that suffused those first 6 films. It's an interesting flavor. As of episode 6, that's the latest one to drop as I'm writing this, the show's made promising efforts sketching out new contours of that mysticism, and I'm enjoying the way it's being smashed up against the sort of medieval Arthurian aesthetic the show's developed. This vibe was always there to a degree. The Jedi aren't just magical warrior monks, they're knights with lightsabers, with a code and all that, but now we've got a dark witch Morgan served by black knights against some very Celtic backdrops, and a whole bunch more. This is a cool new visual and symbolic layer to add to this world, or rather to bring out, and I can't yet tell if there's anything beneath the surface of this space Arthuriana, if it's riffing on any particular stories, but the fact that I am asking this of the show as I'm watching it shows that there are at least the beginnings of an intriguing layer of symbolism here. Now it's anyone's guess whether or not the show will manage to develop any of those sketches into anything more. After all, at what feels like a midpoint, there's only 2 episodes left, but so far, Ahsoka does have a sense of texture to it. There's a lot more you could say about the show, both good and bad. On the one hand, the lightsaber choreography is awesome, capturing the poise and technicality of the era Baylan and Ahsoka were trained in, but eschewing that over-the-top fanciness in a way that wordlessly says a lot about how these X-Order figures understand their role and their age. On the other, it does feel at times that certain stylistic twitches in the show's dialogue and design, Filoni-isms if you will, haven't translated flawlessly to live action. What's more, it seems unlikely that the fairly meager personal growth our protagonist went through in the visually spectacular 5th episode
You lack conviction.
I choose to live.
Will end up having enough narrative significance to make that episode feel like anything other than a runtime guzzling nostalgia fest. But on the whole, I think it's fair to say that Ahsoka falls into the higher tier of Disney Plus era Star Wars content. Maybe it is no Andor, but equally, it's certainly no Book of Boba Fett. I'm fully aware that people's mileage has been varying with Ahsoka, for both stupid reasons and normal ones. But whatever your feelings, you probably agree that it's got better, or at least more interesting. That whole mini review you just sat through, had I given one after, say, episode 2, the tone would have been quite different indeed. Those first 2 episodes weren't bad, but they did feel awfully slow. I remember having to rewind that opening map finding sequence twice because I just kept zoning out. Now, I don't have the longest attention span in the world. I tried to get tested for ADHD once, but I couldn't even make myself complete the forms they sent me. But it isn't just me. A lot of other people have said similar things. This show started off slow. And there's no real issue with that in the abstract, but Ahsoka isn't in the abstract. Let's talk about streaming. When the streaming age started, the binge was king. Netflix did a lot to shake up the TV world, but at least for the viewer, the most obvious difference between traditionally produced and distributed shows and the new generation originals was undoubtedly the way Netflix dropped whole seasons at once. By placing a vast catalogue of existing media at their subscribers' fingertips, Netflix had essentially birthed binging culture, and so by the time they got around to producing those originals, the streamer simply leaned into the binge. Dropping whole seasons was at once good branding, it made watching on Netflix feel unique, and seemingly a move that helped with viewing statistics. And this makes sense. Viewers who liked the binge could watch more content sooner, and those who didn't were tacitly pressured to do the same. If your friends all binged Stranger Things on release day, you're gonna feel pretty left out until you can talk about it too. So you watch it sooner than you would have done, and you get to join in. But by next week, well, you've talked about Stranger Things, you've woven your theories, and you start talking about something else. After Netflix pioneered the modern streaming service, competitor after competitor turned up or ramped up their efforts. From Hulu and YouTube TV through HBO Max and Apple TV, and of course the big boys, Prime Video and Disney+. Strategy-wise, there's been a lot of overlap, notably the elongated movie structure and the season-length downsizing, both of which are relevant but not essential here. Patreon supporters, check the link down below to read this video's endnote about those, but also more than a few divergences, and perhaps the most obvious of these divergences is the move away from all-at-once season drops. It does still happen with a lot of shows, particularly on Netflix, but when the other major players started with their originals, they tended to favor weekly release schedules in a spiritual return to the age of the broadcast. The idea here is that this way, your 6-episode series remains culturally relevant for 6 weeks instead of just 1 or 2. And again, we don't have access to many of the relevant statistics here, but judging by the way that even Netflix has started breaking up the releases of its bigger IPs, it seems the staggered release model is a fairly effective one. On paper, at least. Because, well, what if it has a slow start? Ahsoka's 2-part premiere was intriguing. It was a premiere typical for a streaming show in 2023. All start, all maneuvering pieces into place, setting up the story. Again, it was intriguing. It was not gripping. You didn't come away thinking, wow, I just watched 2 great episodes of television. You came away thinking, okay, that was a good start. This streaming style of series pacing doesn't exist for no reason. If I'm on Netflix and I've watched a show with an intriguing premiere, I'm fairly likely to let that autoplay ticker continue and get sucked in. But if I can't, well, I might remember to check back a week later if I feel like it, but I might not. Andor is an interesting comparison point here. That show was also something of a slow burn. Granted, the show was written with a stronger sense of episodic narrative flow than Ahsoka, but relative to the energy it'd go on to accrue, it certainly didn't come out of the gate at full throttle. But the show's release strategy allowed for this. Likely because that show had 12 episodes, Disney Plus saw fit to initially release 3 episodes. The intrigued viewer could continue onward until the end of the show's first 3-episode pod, at which point the momentum was clear. Ahsoka started to really hit its stride around episode 4, which was great if you were still watching, because that was 2 weeks after the show started, and started without a bang. So, hey, there's that elephant again. Not only did the non-cartoon viewing audience have to work to get their bearings for those first 3 episodes, to keep up with a whole set of unfamiliar names, plot points, and backstories, they also had to wait a pretty long time to start getting the payoff for that task. Let's not forget the context here either. The viewer likely had to do all this, had to maintain that intrigue after being burned by other similarly slow-starting projects which never actually got cooking. Cast your mind back to the last high-profile show to drop on Disney+. Marvel's Secret Invasion started out with a fairly well-liked premiere. The invasion itself hadn't really got off the ground, but the performances seemed good and the tone felt just right. For the next week or two, the internet held its breath, waiting for the show to get good, to build something on that foundation, but it just sort of didn't. And on top of all this, the viewer also had to maintain that intrigue in the face of an increasingly negative online environment. A week between episodes can give time for hype to build, but it also gives time for narratives to form. So by the time the show starts to pick up, Guy Online's been piss-tweeting about it for weeks, and the loser squad have already made a ruckus about fucking crossed arms, or whatever it was this time. So there's nothing wrong with a slow start in the abstract, but the process of receiving, discussing, evaluating, and responding to art is not an abstract one. Speaking practically then, a slow start poses challenges. Challenges which, in this type of staggered release model, cannot be binged away. I say all this not out of some impulse to white knight Disney Plus Star Wars. Believe it or not, I'm not overly concerned about the bottom line of any streaming platform. Shocker, I know. No, I just think all this is immensely interesting. It's interesting to think that the drawbacks of current models of streaming, as highlighted by Ahsoka, might someday cause this pendulum to swing back, that if streamers are going to stagger these releases, they'll come to see that audiences need a reason to tune back in, that starts which are only starts won't cut it, and that this type of serialized, cut-up, slow-burn style isn't suited to week-by-week watching. It's interesting to think that what seemed at first to be innovations in form may go down in history as bizarre, short-lived deviations. And it's even more interesting to realize that there's a corporate logistical disharmony here, to think that the goals of this whole Mandoverse connectivity project, to build hype, build an engaged audience, to keep that audience engaged throughout this small screen saga, and oh yeah, to tell a good story, are to some degree at odds with the in-practice reality of the format that project is built upon. It's interesting to think that this disharmony is starting to have real, visible knock-on effects on the status and reception of that project's constituent parts, and it's also interesting that there seems to be a fairly simple step Disney Plus could take to at least lessen the problem here. Look to Andor, look to Stranger Things Season 4 even, match the release schedule to the pace of the show. Something like The Mandalorian, or at least the more episodic Mandalorian of Seasons 1 and 2. Something like Tales of the Jedi, sure, go week by week. But a slow burner or a binge model continuous story with one long start, one long middle, and one end? Something like Ahsoka or even Kenobi, which doesn't kick into gear right away? If these are written as more continuous stories, not as episodes, then given this new binge-facilitating release infrastructure the past decade has built, there's no reason they shouldn't be experienced in a more continuous fashion. Ahsoka would have made more sense if it had dropped all at once, or at least if that premiere had been twice as long. Going forward, why not tailor a show's release strategy to that show? Maybe that means some of them will run for less time, be relevant for less time, but the viewing experience and reception will probably be better. Will any of that happen? Who knows? But, like I said, interesting, right? So, in conclusion, I don't know if Ahsoka's going to stick the landing. I don't know if we'll look back on it as a slow burn, or as a misfire that got good for a bit in the middle. But I do know that it feels like a show at odds with its format, and that sticking blindly to this format is only going to hinder these shows and the way we engage with them in the future. I'd like to thank you for sticking this video out, especially if you're a Clone Wars fan. Sorry. May the like and subscribe be with you, and big shout out as always to all my supporters on YouTube and Patreon you're seeing now, especially Daniel Goldhorn, Karen Kuhlman, Magath, Ryan Emily, Something Capitalism Bad, Thomas R, and Weirdy Beardy. See you later.